Deep in the Arctic sky, a Soviet bomber cuts through the freezing air, and inside its bay hangs a weapon so powerful it would rewrite the limits of destruction. This was the AN 602, the Tsar Bomba, and today you will see how it worked, how it was tested, and why no weapon like it was ever built again. The Tsar Bomba carried a 60 million horsepower blast inside its shell, and before it detonated, the world had never seen energy released on that scale. But the story behind the device is even stranger because it was engineered as much for politics as for physics. To understand what this bomb really was, you must start with its design. A colossal cylinder, 6.9 feet wide and 26 feet long. It was as big as a London double decker bus, and it weighed more than 54,000 pounds, giving it the presence of a falling building. Its outer shell was steel, wrapped with beryllium plating, and beneath that sat a special thermal insulation layer to keep its internal components stable. At the front, engineers installed a control module with sensors, antennas, and altitude systems that acted like the brain of the device. At the rear sat three fixed fins that kept the bomb stable, because if this weapon rotated or tumbled, its internal timing chain could fail. Behind those fins, engineers packed a parachute system the size of a small apartment, built to slow the bomb before detonation, but the bomb could not be tested with any ordinary aircraft. So the Soviets modified a Tu-95 bomber into a version known as the Tu-95V. They widened its bomb bay to nearly 6 feet and extended it to more than 23 feet, pushing the aircraft's structure to its limits. Fuel tanks were removed, internal barriers relocated, and the tail guns replaced with shock sensors that would record radiation and pressure. The entire aircraft was painted in reflective white because without this coating, the heat from the blast would have scorched the plane mid flight. Even after all these changes, the bomb was too large to fit, so it still had to be carried partially outside the aircraft like a suspended giant. Once it was secured, the Tu-95V rolled down the runway of Olenya Air Base and climbed into the Arctic sky at full throttle. The plane headed toward Novaya Zemlya, a remote archipelago in the far north, chosen specifically because no other landscape could contain the blast. Its test area, Zone S, lay 9 miles from Mityushika Bay and more than 30 miles from the settlement of Severny, which had been emptied in preparation. By 11:32 in the morning, the bomber reached the release point, and the crew began the final countdown to history's most powerful explosion. The bomb dropped, and immediately the first parachute deployed, dragging out layers of increasingly larger canopies. The parachute system expanded in stages, each one slowing the descent a little more and giving the plane a fighting chance to escape. Inside the cockpit, the pilots looked back at the falling Titan, knowing they had less than 3 minutes before detonation. The bomb drifted downward for 188 seconds, and that controlled fall gave the crew time to turn and climb at maximum speed. At 13,000 feet, the altimeters confirmed the final height, and the internal safeties disengaged with silent precision. Inside the primary charge, spark gaps fired, and in that instant, the entire core began collapsing inward in a perfect synchronized detonation. A burst of neutrons flooded the plutonium sphere, igniting a chain reaction hotter than the center of the sun. Temperatures soared to 100 million degrees, and gamma rays blasted outward with unimaginable power. These rays struck the fusion stage, turning its interior into a miniature star that grew more violent by the millisecond. Hydrogen isotopes fused under extreme pressure, releasing energy far greater than the first stage could ever produce alone. The bomb's casing vaporized instantly into glowing plasma, and the unstoppable chain reached its peak. A flash brighter than daylight shattered the sky, turning the Arctic white and drowning out shadows for miles. The fireball expanded to 5 miles wide and rose upward like a burning planet erupting from the earth. Ground shock reflected upward, flattening the fireball's underside and preventing it from touching the soil. This single detail prevented massive fallout and made the Tsar Bomba the cleanest megaton blast ever created. The rising fireball transformed into a mushroom cloud that climbed 40 miles into the sky and pierced the upper atmosphere. From above, the cloud spread wider than major cities, forming a disk nearly 60 miles across. The shock wave traveled so far that it slammed into the retreating Tu-95V from more than 60 miles away. The bomber shook violently, and for a moment, the pilots believed the aircraft had been torn apart. On the ground, the blast carved the earth into black molten rock, creating a scorched lake of glass. The settlement of Severny was erased completely. Structures reduced to debris as if scraped from the map. The tremor traveled across continents and shook buildings in Norway and Finland hundreds of miles away. Scientists realized that no battlefield could ever justify a weapon of this size because its impact extended across nations. The test forced world leaders to rethink nuclear escalation because the alternative was too catastrophic to imagine. Within 2 years, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed, ending atmospheric nuclear explosions. The Tsar Bomba became a symbol of power, but also a warning about how far humanity could push the world. It remains the largest human made explosion ever recorded, and likely the largest that will ever be allowed to occur again. Even today, this single detonation is studied as a reminder of what unchecked engineering could unleash. But it also stands as evidence that some boundaries once crossed cannot be crossed again safely.